A biting wind whistled through the dusty main street of Cheyenne, Wyoming, as Ruby Hathaway stepped off the stagecoach. Clutching a small valise, she felt every stare bearing down on her, from the young ranch hands gawking at her generous figure to the older matrons sneering at the worn edges of her simple bonnet. There was no warm welcome for a mail-order bride no one had asked for. But beneath that quiet desperation that lingered in her gaze, a certain flicker of determination refused to die. Far beyond the ridicule high up in the snow-capped mountains lurked a rugged frontiersman, an unexpected ally, whose own destiny hung on meeting the woman everyone else had already dismissed. Ruby Hathaway had spent 5 miserable days on a jolting stagecoach from her hometown of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to the bustling frontier settlement of Cheyenne in the Wyoming Territory. Every bone in her body protested the grueling ride, and her nerves were frayed by her uncertain future. She had answered a mail-order bride advertisement that promised stability, warmth, and a chance to escape the unyielding judgments of those who mocked her figure back east. The letter had come from a rancher named Harold Beckett. It was short and almost painfully direct. Wanted wife with strong constitution and willingness to work. Must endure the hardships of frontier life. Will provide home and companionship. Please reply, post haste. Desperate for a new beginning. Ruby had taken a chance. She had no family to speak of. Her parents died in a tenement fire years before, and her only living relative, a distant cousin, offered her neither solace nor a welcome home. When Harold's letter arrived, hope blossomed in her heart like spring buds after a harsh winter. Yet sitting in the stagecoach with the final stop just behind her, the reality of the place struck with an unforgiving clarity. Cheyenne in the 1870s was a rough, tumbleweed-strewn town, quickly expanding because of the newly laid Union Pacific Railroad that passed nearby. Real name, real steel rails. Real travel, this was the frontier. Not some romantic notion. Her heart lurched with equal parts excitement and trepidation. Gathering her skirts and her courage, Ruby clutched the handle of her valise and stepped from the coach onto the dirt-packed street. The first thing she noticed was the dryness of the air. It seemed to crackle with energy charged by the endless possibilities of the West. The second thing she noticed was the way people looked at her. Ruby was not slight, nor was she what polite society would call comely. She was what some more charitable folk might call voluptuous, but most especially the snickering types would say she was large. It had always been a source of ridicule. On the eastern seaboard, she'd faced the cruelties of suitors who thought her figure was more comedic than appealing. Yet for all the heartbreak, she was made of sterner stuff. She had spirit kindness and an unbreakable spine qualities that set her apart in ways more profound than mere aesthetics. The dusty street burned under the noon sun. But Ruby stood tall. She scanned the crowd for Harold Beckett, the man who'd sent for her. But he was nowhere in sight. Hours passed, and still no one came to claim her. Ruby waited outside the modest stage station. Her nerves wound themselves tighter with every tick of the clock. Concerned the station master, a wiry man named Seth, finally ambled over. "Miss, you're expecting someone?" he asked, squinting in the bright sunlight. His weathered face held a kind expression that suggested he'd seen his share of hopeful souls abandoned in a new land. "Yes, sir," Ruby replied, shifting her weight anxiously from one foot to the other. "He was to meet me here. His name is Harold Beckett. He operates a ranch just outside of Cheyenne." Seth scratched at the stubble on his chin. "Don't know a Harold Beckett, but I can ask around. Maybe he got held up. Cheyenne's big, and if he's coming by wagon, it might take time." Ruby nodded gratefully, though a cold dread twisted in her stomach. What if Harold decided he didn't want her after all? Maybe he caught a glimpse of her from afar and fled, appalled by her large hips and broad shoulders. That fear gnawed at her. As evening fell, the passers-by became fewer and fewer, and the warm glow of lanterns in the saloons and general stores illuminated the street. Exhausted and dispirited, Ruby asked the station master if there was a boarding house or hotel where she could spend the night. "Sure is," said Seth, pointing down the main street. "Wilma's boarding house a couple blocks down. Room might set you back a bit, but it's clean, and Wilma keeps the rowdy patrons in line." Ruby mustered a small, polite smile, thanked Seth for his help, and headed off. Each step through the swirling dust felt heavier than the last. As she approached the boarding house, she wondered if fate had doomed her to a life of disappointment. Wilma's boarding house was a squat, weathered building with a sign that read, "Beds and Meals, Respectable Lodging in Peeling Paint." Inside, the smell of freshly baked bread warred with the odor of boiled cabbage. A large woman in a calico dress strode up to greet Ruby with an air of hushed efficiency. "Evening," said Wilma. "You looking for a room?" "I am." Ruby answered quietly, setting down her valise. My fiancé didn't meet me. I don't know what happened." She tried to keep the tremor from her voice, but exhaustion and uncertainty made her vulnerable. Wilma's eyes flickered sympathetically. "Sorry to hear that. I've seen it before, sad to say. Men put out them advertise, then get cold feet or find a different girl they fancy more." Ruby winced at the implication, but kept her composure. "Yes, well, perhaps there's an explanation. I only need a night or two until I figure out what happened." "Nothing wrong with that," Wilma replied, leading Ruby to a small, tidy room at the end of the second-floor corridor. $1 a night, breakfast included. "Will that suit you?" Ruby was grateful the price wasn't higher. She nodded, handing over what little money she had. Wilma gave a quick smile, showed her how to lock the door from inside, and then withdrew, leaving Ruby alone with her thoughts. Tired though she was, the humiliation of being abandoned gnawed at her. She feared news of her predicament would spread through town. The townsfolk tittering about the big mail-order bride left at the stage station. She tried to hold back tears, but a few escaped down her cheeks. There, in that cramped room, Ruby prayed for strength. She prayed that tomorrow she would find Harold, or at least discover the truth, because the only thing worse than heartbreak was the gnawing uncertainty of not knowing whether she had a future at all. Morning dawned in a blaze of golden light, but Ruby hardly noticed as she made her way down the steps. Her eyes ringed with weariness. The parlor of the boarding house buzzed with muted conversation. A pair of ranchers lingered over their coffee at a corner table, and a traveling merchant perused a battered newspaper. Wilma quickly brought Ruby a plate of eggs and biscuits. Grateful for the meal, Ruby ate quietly, her mind spinning with possibilities. Perhaps Harold had been robbed on the road. Perhaps he'd taken ill. And this possibility cut her like a knife. Perhaps he simply no longer wanted her. After breakfast, she set out through the dusty streets, determined to find answers. She visited the mercantile, the smithy, even the saloon, any place where a rancher might do business. But each time she asked for Harold Beckett, she was met with a blank stare or a dismissive shrug. Around midday, she finally found someone who claimed to know of him. A clerk at the local feed store snapped his fingers in recognition. "Oh, Harold Beckett," he said. "Reckon he's that fella who had a small spread to the north. Came by once or twice for supplies. Don't recall seeing him for near 2 months, though. Heard he was looking to sell his property." "Sell?" Ruby echoed, her heart dropping. Do you know if he actually did? The clerk shrugged. Might have. Last time I saw him, he was talking to a big cattle baron from Colorado, a man by the name of Farnsworth. Harold looked set on leaving these parts. Could be he's halfway across the country by now. Ruby's vision swam as panic tightened her chest. Why then had Harold written her? Could he have changed his mind and not bothered to inform her? Had he made arrangements for her lodging or expected her to fend for herself? A group of rugged men in work clothes drifted closer, half listening. One of them, a square-jawed ranch hand, remarked under his breath, "Poor woman." Betty took one look at her and fled. Snickers followed. Ruby's cheeks burned as she turned away. She refused to burst into tears in front of them. Summoning all the dignity she had left, she exited the feed store, ignoring the second round of snickers that trailed her. Little did she know that this very moment, this public, humiliating moment, would soon be the turning point of her fate. And it would involve a mysterious man from the high mountains who had been passing through town that day, overhearing whispers of her predicament. His name was Sawyer McAllister, a solitary trapper and guide known to the locals as a man who rarely came down from his mountain cabin. Tall, broad-shouldered, and bearing the perpetual look of a wolf eyeing civilization with wariness, Sawyer was the type of man who at first glance drew both intrigue and caution from townsfolk. Sawyer had come to Cheyenne to resupply. He seldom lingered in saloons or took part in idle conversation. Instead, he slipped in and out of the general store, then headed back up to the wilderness he called home. But on this particular day, fate intervened. As he walked along the boardwalk outside the feed store, arms laden with sacks of flour and other provisions, he caught a fleeting glimpse of Ruby's tear-streaked face as she hurried away. The humiliating jokes and cruel remarks of the ranch hands drifted through the open doorway, making it all too obvious what had happened. Something about her stricken expression pierced Sawyer's armor. Perhaps it was her proud posture, her attempt to maintain dignity while the town pitied and mocked her. He had been the object of whispers himself, labeled as an oddity for choosing solitude over the bustle of society. People ridiculed what they didn't understand, or what did not fit neatly into their narrow definitions of beauty or worth. He watched her disappear around a corner, and a silent pang of protectiveness stirred in his gut. It was a feeling he recognized from years of defending injured animals in the wild. Instinct told him to leave it be. He was a man of the mountains, not a caretaker for lost souls. Yet something compelled him to follow, or at least to find out more about this woman. "Sawyer, is that you?" came a cheerful greeting. It was Dr. Weston, an elderly physician who sometimes visited the mountain man's cabin to check on local homesteaders. "Didn't expect to see you in town." Sawyer nodded a curt hello, shifting his burdens. Stocking up, he replied in his low, rumbling voice, "Heard something about a mail-order bride being left high and dry." Dr. Weston's bushy eyebrows rose. "Yes, that unfortunate business. Poor woman's been wandering around asking after her fiancé. Rumor has it he sold his ranch and lit out for parts unknown. The people here have been less than kind." A flicker of anger crossed Sawyer's features. "She has no one," the doctor sighed. "None that I've heard of. She's holed up in Wilma's boarding house. You can find her there if you've got a mind to." Sawyer just grunted in acknowledgement before turning on his heel and heading up the street. The good doctor stared after him, guessing that something had lit a fuse in the solitary mountain man. Sawyer's footsteps were heavy on the warped floorboards of Wilma's boarding house porch. The midday sun glared overhead, dust swirling around his boots with every step. He set his supplies down near a wooden bench, took off his battered hat, and ran a hand through his dark hair. He was not a man used to making social calls. Inside the parlor was modest but clean, with lace curtains filtering sunlight. Wilma looked up from behind the front desk with curiosity. She recognized Sawyer by reputation, though she rarely saw him in person. "Mr. McAllister, can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Looking for the lady who came in yesterday," he said, his voice resonant. "Name's Ruby Hathaway." Wilma's brow furrowed in mild concern. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, a bit awkward. "Heard she's in a bad spot. Figured she might need some assistance." Wilma's expression softened. "Poor dear sure does. But she's proud, that one. Doesn't want charity. She's in the parlor right now." Wilma glanced toward a door down the hall. "But I have to warn you, she's been upset all morning." Sawyer nodded his thanks and stepped quietly down the corridor. He paused at the threshold of the parlor, where he saw Ruby, seated on a worn floral sofa, her face in her hands. Her shoulders trembled slightly. A delicate whimper escaped her throat, proof of tears that she was trying and failing to suppress. He cleared his throat softly, so as not to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, his deep voice reverberating in the small room. Ruby glanced up, eyes red-rimmed, cheeks flushed. Instantly she straightened her posture, as though expecting another stranger to belittle her. Her eyes flickered with confusion at the sight of this tall, broad-shouldered figure looming in the doorway. May I help you?" she asked, voice wavering. Sawyer removed his hat and held it in front of him, a gesture of respect. "Name's Sawyer McAllister. I heard about your predicament and thought I'd see if there's anything I can do." She regarded him warily. "You heard about me. The entire town has, it seems." "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. "Small place gossip travels quick." Ruby's face tightened. Shame burned anew. She folded her hands in her lap, struggling to maintain composure. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. McAllister, but I hardly know you." Sawyer looked uncomfortable. Interpersonal niceties were not his strong suit. "I don't mean to pry," he said, "but I know what it's like to be alone out here, with no one to turn to. You got a place to stay beyond this boarding house?" "Any money." Her silence was answer enough. She had precious little coin left, certainly not enough to remain at the boarding house indefinitely. "Let me help," he offered. "I'm not looking for a wife," he quickly clarified. "But I got a cabin in the mountains. It's a decent place. Might not be easy living, but you'd be safe until you get your feet under. You figure out what you want to do." Ruby studied him carefully. A kindly expression touched his rough features, and though his clothing was worn and plain, there was a certain dignified bearing about him. He didn't strike her as a man who offered help lightly, yet the notion of going off with a stranger to a remote cabin was terrifying. She had endured enough heartbreak and disappointment to know how dangerous it could be to trust blindly. "Why would you do this for me?" "Mr. McAllister?" she asked softly. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I was raised to offer a hand when folks are in trouble," he finally said. "You seem like you're in trouble, and you don't deserve to be stranded here, mocked by the likes of them men at the feed store. You can take time to think it over." Ruby looked down at her clasped hands. The offer was both tempting and frightening. But was there truly a better alternative? If Harold Beckett had indeed left, and she was alone, her options were painfully limited. "May I have some time to consider?" Sawyer nodded. "Of course. I'll be leaving town tomorrow. You can find me at the livery stable in the morning if you decide to come." With that, he gently placed his hat back on his head, gave a polite tip of the brim, and withdrew from the room, leaving Ruby both shaken and intrigued by the mountain man's unexpected kindness. That night, Ruby hardly slept. Doubt waged a fierce battle in her mind, but so did desperation. In the morning, after a sparse breakfast, she stood by the window of her small boarding-house room staring at the lively street below. The clatter of wagons and horses reached her ears, along with the sharp calls of merchants and the low roar of travelers in search of fortune. Ruby had precious few coins left. She could remain at Wilmer's for perhaps another day or two, but that would solve nothing. She'd be forced to find work, and the only options for an unwed, penniless woman in a rough frontier town were limited and often perilous. Then there was Sawyer McAllister. He didn't strike her as a saint, but neither did he seem the type to exploit a vulnerable woman. He was quiet, straightforward, almost brusque, but there had been genuine concern in his eyes when he spoke to her. The memory of the ranch hands laughing of the clerk in the feed store, shrugging dismissively, burned fresh in her mind. She had endured a lifetime of mockery for her figure and her perceived lack of beauty, but for once it would be a relief to be around someone who viewed her as a person in need, not a punchline. Steeling her resolve, she gathered her belongings and paid Wilmer for one more night's lodging. Then she left a note of thanks on her bed. Taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air, she made her way to the livery stable. When she arrived, Sawyer was at the stable's entrance, loading provisions onto the back of his sturdy mule. He looked up as she approached, giving a terse nod. "Mornin', Miss Hathaway. Mr. McAllister," she greeted, noticing the speckling of grey in his otherwise black hair. The faint lines etched around his eyes which suggested a life lived in harsh conditions. He met her gaze, perhaps searching for any hint of second thoughts. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. She swallowed. "Yes. If you're still offering me safe haven." "I am," he confirmed. Then he pointed to a roan mare saddled nearby. "I borrowed a horse from the stable for you. Don't worry, it's a gentle one." Ruby eyed the mare, exhaling slowly. She'd only ridden a horse once before in her life, and it had been a short, uncomfortable experience. "I'm not the best rider, Mr. McAllister." "Sawyer," he corrected. "Just keep your seat steady. We've got a 2-day ride ahead, and I'll keep our pace manageable." 2 days. That revelation jostled her nerves. She imagined the vast, untamed wilderness, the potential dangers, but she squared her shoulders and reminded herself she had already braved the stagecoach and this unwelcoming town. Together they set out, leaving the dusty streets of Cheyenne behind. As the day wore on, they passed rolling plains dotted with sagebrush, gradually climbing into higher elevations. The sky overhead was a clear, intense blue, the wind carrying scents of pine and wild grasses. Conversation between them was sparse, punctuated by the steady clop of hooves. Yet Ruby felt a strange sense of relief, as though every step she took led her further from the shame of being abandoned and ridiculed. They made camp that night near a clear-running creek. Ruby helped gather firewood and prepared a simple meal of beans and salted pork. Though unused to the chores of wilderness life, she worked diligently, determined not to be dead weight. "Why do you live so far out of town?" she asked as they sat by the campfire. Sawyer shrugged. "I like the solitude. Too many folks in one place, they start judging each other for no good reason. Up in the mountains, it's just you and the land. Makes a man honest." Ruby understood the appeal given how relentless people could be in their judgments. She found herself feeling unexpectedly safe with Sawyer, even with the wilderness around them. That night, she slept under the open sky for the first time in her life, lulled by the hush of wind through pine boughs. Early the next afternoon, they finally reached Sawyer's cabin, nestled in a sheltered valley, flanked by towering pines and rugged peaks. It was simple, a single-story log structure with a stone chimney, a small corral for livestock, and a storage shed for pelts and supplies. But it was also peaceful, surrounded by wildflowers and pine trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Ruby gazed around, her heart fluttering with both awe and trepidation. This was nothing like the crowded lanes of Portsmouth or the bustling streets of Cheyenne. This was nature in its purest form. "It's beautiful," she breathed, surprising herself with how sincerely she meant it. Sawyer dismounted, gave a curt nod. "It's home," he said. "Inside's not fancy, but it's got a bed in the spare room. You can have that. I'll bunk in the loft." As he helped her down from her horse, their eyes met. A subtle blush spread across her cheeks, but he seemed not to notice. She wondered why a man as strong and steady as Sawyer had never taken a wife or tried to settle down, perhaps the same reason that others had judged her on sight. Sometimes people just didn't see the worth beneath the surface. They led the horses to the corral unsaddled and rubbed them down. That evening, Ruby did her best to cook a hearty stew from the provisions Sawyer had, and though it was a modest meal, the flavor and warmth comforted them both after the arduous journey. As they settled in the snug glow of firelight within the cabin, Ruby felt an unexpected sense of contentment. She still had no idea what her future held, but at least for the moment, she had a roof over her head and a sense of dignity that she had not felt in Cheyenne. In the weeks that followed, Ruby settled into a routine with Sawyer's gentle but gruff guidance. She rose early to help with chores, hauling water from the creek, feeding the mule and the horse, learning how to patch clothing and prepare simple meals. She quickly discovered that frontier life was far harsher than any labor she'd done back east. The physical demands, however, gave her a sense of purpose. For so long she had felt inadequate, ridiculed for her size. But here her sturdy build became an asset. She found she could lug heavy buckets without complaint and chop firewood without collapsing in exhaustion. Sawyer, on his part, was impressed, though he was sparing with praise. He also showed her how to handle a rifle. "You need to know how to protect yourself," he said, handing her the weapon with careful instruction on how to load, aim, and fire. Their first practice session left her ears ringing and her nerves frayed, but she persevered. Though still reserved, Sawyer began to open up in small ways. He told her about his childhood in Virginia, how he'd run away from an abusive father at age 14 and found his way west, learning to trap and guide in the Rockies. He confessed that he avoided towns because he'd never quite fit in. "I prefer open sky," he said simply, as though that summed up all the complexities of his life. Ruby, in turn, shared her own past, her parents' tragic death, her ill-fated attempt at being a mail-order bride, and the humiliations that had plagued her. Talking to him felt oddly natural, even comforting. He listened without judgment, his dark eyes steady and thoughtful. And slowly, something fragile yet potent began to take root between them, a mutual respect, perhaps even a sense of belonging. Neither dared to name it, but it lingered in the cabin's hushed evenings as they sat by the fire, forging an unspoken bond. Weeks bled into months, and as winter approached, Ruby found herself better prepared for the cold mountain climate. She had learned to mend worn blankets, can vegetables for the long freeze, and even assist Sawyer in salting meat from his hunts. The once foreign tasks now felt routine, offering her a sense of accomplishment. But life in the mountains was not without peril. Storms rolled in with little warning, bringing blizzards that howled through the pines. One particularly fierce storm trapped them indoors for days. Huddled inside, they stoked the fire and rationed their food carefully, each mindful that winter could be unforgiving. During these confined days, Ruby noticed Sawyer's lingering stares, something almost tender in the way he'd watch her read or sew by the firelight. She tried to ignore the flutter in her heart, reminding herself they were merely survival companions. He had said he wasn't looking for a wife, and what had she to offer him anyway? She was still the woman who had been mocked and abandoned. Then came the day something new intruded upon their mountain. Haven a visitor. A trapper named Clem Rogers arrived just after a thaw seeking supplies and a warm place to rest. Sawyer rarely entertained guests, but Clem was a friend, so Sawyer let him stay for the night. Clem eyed Ruby with unabashed curiosity. "Don't usually see womenfolk up here," he remarked. "Heard rumors in Cheyenne about a big mail-order bride being left behind." He let out a brief, uncomfortable chuckle and cast a sideways glance at Ruby. No offense. Ruby's face burned, but Sawyer's jaw tightened. "Her name's Ruby," he said, voice low. "And you'll speak to her respectfully, under my roof." The trapper blinked in surprise, stammered an apology. Ruby felt a rush of gratitude, her heart pounding at Sawyer's defense of her dignity. Yet the incident reminded her that beyond these cabin walls, society's cruel whispers still awaited. Spring came slowly, the drifts receding to reveal carpets of wildflowers. One morning, Sawyer decided to head into Cheyenne to trade furs and replenish supplies. Ruby accompanied him, both curious and anxious about returning to the place of her humiliation. The town looked the same: dusty streets, bustling crowds, and the clang of blacksmiths. Yet Ruby felt different, stronger. She walked with her head held high. Some of the old stares returned, but she also caught glimpses of surprise. She was no longer the timid, tearful woman who had arrived on the stagecoach. While Sawyer sold pelts at the trading post, Ruby visited the tiny post office on a whim, curious if any letter might have arrived for her. The postmaster, a stout man with spectacles, rustled through a stack of mail. "By golly," he said, pulling out a tattered envelope. "We've had this sit in here for months, addressed to Miss Ruby Hathaway." Hands trembling. Ruby took the letter. The return address read, Harold Beckett, Denver, Colorado. She stared in disbelief. Her erstwhile fiancé had actually written. She stepped outside and tore open the envelope, her breath hitching as her eyes scanned the words. "Dearest Ruby, I owe you a profound apology. I realize I left you in an awful predicament. My decision was rash and cruel. I intended to sell my ranch and move to Denver for a business opportunity. In the process, I lost track of time and neglected to inform you of my change of plans. My conscience weighs heavily, and I beg your forgiveness. If you are still willing, I should like to extend an invitation for you to join me in Denver. I have established a small but promising enterprise, and I remain in need of a wife. I will provide for you in all the ways I once promised, and more. Yours sincerely, Harold Beckett." Ruby's heart pounded with a tumult of emotions. Anger, relief, confusion. The man who had humiliated her now sought another chance. A future in Denver might be stable, but could she truly trust Harold again? As she stood on the boardwalk, letter in hand, Sawyer approached, reading the turmoil in her features. She handed him the letter. He scanned it quickly, his expression inscrutable. "What are you going to do?" he asked, returning it to her. She looked around at the chaotic bustle of Cheyenne, at the wagons and the saloons, the shops and the stagecoaches that carried people to new horizons. For so long she had yearned for acceptance, once pinned all her hopes on Harold Beckett. Now she had found something unexpected in the mountains, something real, something that might even be love. But was it mutual, or was she simply a convenient companion to Sawyer? "I don't know," she whispered, her chest tight. "He says he's sorry. He still wants me to be his wife." Sawyer's eyes flickered with something akin to pain, but he quickly masked it. "A man ought to keep his word," he said flatly. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes, not just from the letter, but from Sawyer's reaction. Do you think I should go?" His gaze dropped. He ran a thumb over the brim of his hat. "You need to decide what's best for yourself, Ruby. Denver might offer you a better life than a cabin in the mountains." He cleared his throat. "What I can offer is what you've seen. Hard work, solitude. I don't want to tie you down if you have a chance for something better." The word stung an unintentional blow. Could he really believe that living in the mountains with him wasn't already something better? Torn. Ruby wrote a brief response to Harold, stating she needed time to consider his proposal. She dropped the letter in the outgoing mail bin and spent the rest of the day in pensive silence. She wasn't sure what she wanted or what she deserved. That night in the makeshift campsite outside town, Sawyer silently stoked the fire. Ruby sat across from him, the tension almost palpable. Finally, she gathered her courage and spoke. "Why did you really bring me to your cabin?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. "Why didn't you leave me to fend for myself in Cheyenne?" He looked up the firelight dancing across his stubbled jaw. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer. Because I saw someone who deserved better than what she'd been dealt." Her heart thudded. She wanted so badly to believe he felt something deeper for her, that his protective instinct ran parallel to a more personal affection. But he only offered cryptic words. "You're a good man," she said softly. He gave a short, humorless chuckle. "I ain't that good. And you deserve more than just a crust of bread in a lonely cabin. You deserve acceptance, a community. Maybe even fancy dresses and big parlors, if that's what you want." She blinked back tears. "All I've ever truly wanted is kindness and love. Out here, I've found more of that in months than I ever did in years back east." Sawyer held her gaze, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her hand or utter words of longing. But he remained silent, trapped in his own reservations. The following weeks brought an unexpected development. A wave of sickness spread through the region, sparing neither townspeople nor those in remote homesteads. Dr. Weston visited the mountain cabin to warn Sawyer and Ruby that a dangerous fever was circulating. The sickness struck Sawyer first late one evening. He collapsed outside while chopping wood, drenched in sweat and delirious with fever. Panicked Ruby half carried, half dragged him into the cabin. She stoked the fire and brewed every herbal remedy she knew, applying cool compresses to his burning forehead. His condition deteriorated rapidly. He trembled violently, muttering incoherently. Desperate for aid, Ruby saddled the horse at dawn, riding through rough terrain to find Dr. Weston. The journey nearly exhausted her, but her determination overrode any thought of personal discomfort. She found the doctor just as he was departing Cheyenne for another patient. Together they raced back to the cabin, where Dr. Weston administered what limited medicine he had. The old physician didn't sugarcoat the situation. "He's young and strong, but this fever's taken down sturdier men," he warned. For days, Ruby nursed Sawyer relentlessly. She fed him broth, kept him hydrated, and used every cooling measure possible. She sang softly to him when he tossed in delirium, whispering prayers for his recovery. The memory of how he had rescued her from the ridicule of Cheyenne replayed in her mind, fueling her resolve. At last his fever broke, leaving him weak but stable. Ruby wept in relief when his eyes opened in recognition one morning. "You stayed," he croaked, throat parched. She smiled, tears sparkling. "Of course I stayed, you foolish man. Where else would I go?" Though he couldn't muster much strength, Sawyer lifted his hand to gently cup Ruby's cheek. The tender gesture spoke volumes far more than words could convey. She pressed her hand over his warmth blooming in her chest. Sawyer's recovery was slow, painfully slow, The fever had taken a brutal toll on his body, sapping him of strength and leaving his tall frame gaunt and pale. For days after the fever broke, he drifted in and out of restless sleep, his voice weak and body trembling, with even the smallest effort. Ruby stayed by his side through it all, barely resting herself, determined to see him through the worst. In those long, quiet days, the cabin became more than a shelter. It became a crucible in which Ruby's resilience was tested, tempered and ultimately forged into something stronger. She hauled buckets of water from the icy creek-chopped wood with awkward but improving strokes and managed meals with limited supplies. Though her muscles ached and her hands blistered, she never once complained. At night, she would sit beside Sawyer, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead or gently stroking his hand. Sometimes he would murmur incoherent things, half-formed memories or thoughts that revealed fragments of his past, of the loneliness he had long buried beneath silence and solitude. "I used to fish in the Shenandoah River with my brother. Before the war," he whispered once, barely audible. Ruby leaned closer, clutching his hand. "You'll fish again," she promised, even if she wasn't sure it was true. When the fever finally broke, Sawyer's eyes opened and held hers with clarity, for the first time in days. His voice was raw and ragged. "You stayed," he rasped. Ruby smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Of course I stayed, you foolish man," she said, softly, brushing damp hair from his brow. "Where else would I go?" Sawyer's hand trembled as he reached for her cheek, fingers barely grazing her skin. The touch was light but electric, more intimate than any kiss. It held unspoken words, gratitude, vulnerability, something deeper still. As his strength returned, Ruby resumed the rhythm of mountain life, only now she did it not as a guest or a dependent, but as someone who belonged. She hunted small game with careful aim, tended to the animals, and maintained the fire. Her figure, once mocked for its softness, now served her well. Her strength was not just emotional, it was physical, tangible, proven with every swing of the axe or armful of firewood. Then one crisp morning, as frost still clung to the pine needles, a peddler arrived. He was a wiry man with a mule and cart selling pots, linens, and trinkets from the east. He also carried letters. "There's one here for a Miss Ruby Hathaway," he said, handing her a folded envelope. Her heart sank as she saw the handwriting. It was unmistakably Harold Beckett's. Ruby stepped outside, the wind tugging at her shawl, and opened the letter with trembling fingers. "Dearest Ruby, I hope this letter finds you well. I realize how little I deserve your attention, let alone your forgiveness after what I've done. I left in haste, chasing a business opportunity in Denver, but the guilt of abandoning you has never left me. You were right to feel hurt. I was cowardly, overwhelmed by my own fears and expectations. But I want to make things right. I now own a small but promising shop in Denver. I've done well for myself, and I still wish for companionship. I still wish for you. Enclosed is a train ticket to Denver. It would bring me great joy if you would come. We could start anew. I vow to do right by you this time. With respect and hope. Harold Beckett." Ruby stared at the letter, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions spinning inside her. She remembered the humiliation of standing alone in Cheyenne, the pity in Wilma's eyes, the cruel laughter of the men at the feed store. She remembered how her heart had crumbled piece by piece, and yet she also remembered how Sawyer had found her, not as a savior with grand words or promises, but as a quiet presence, offering safety, dignity, and a place to heal. She walked slowly back into the cabin, letter in hand. Sawyer was sitting up in bed, still pale but alert. His dark eyes sharp. He saw the letter and frowned slightly. "From Beckett?" he asked. She nodded and held it out. "He wants me to come to Denver. He says he's sorry. He's offering marriage again." Sawyer took the letter, read it silently, and handed it back without comment. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable. "What are you thinking?" Ruby asked, her voice quiet. Sawyer looked down, his hands clenched in his lap. "That maybe you deserve a man who can offer more than a quiet life in the woods." "Don't say that." "It's true," he said, meeting her gaze. "I can't give you grand parlors or a shop in the city. Just this cabin, a hard life, and me. That's all I want," she said without hesitation. "You think I care about parlors, about ball gowns or gossip and tea parties? I've had enough of trying to fit in with a world that never wanted me." He looked away, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "But if you went to Denver, maybe you'd be seen different. Maybe I don't need Denver to see me. I need you to see me. And you do, Sawyer. You saw me when I was at my worst, and you never turned away." She crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, placing a hand on his chest, right above his heart. "You say you have nothing to offer, but you've given me more than anyone ever has. A home, respect, safety. I didn't come up here for luxury. I came up here to survive. But I stayed because I found something worth living for." He blinked clearly, moved, but still afraid to hope. "You sure?" Ruby leaned forward, kissing his forehead gently. "I'm not leaving. Not now. Not ever." With trembling fingers, she reached for her writing tin and pulled out paper. She sat at the small wooden table and penned a reply to Harold. "Mr. Beckett. I received your letter and your offer. I appreciate your apology and understand that you acted out of fear. But I have found another path, one that brings me peace, strength, and love. I will not be coming to Denver. Respectfully, Ruby Hathaway." The peddler took the letter that afternoon and rode off down the trail. Ruby stood beside Sawyer in the doorway, their fingers intertwined. "Feels like the end of something," he murmured. "No," she said, squeezing his hand. "Feels like the beginning." Sawyer's recovery marked a turning point. One crisp morning, he insisted on joining Ruby outside, leaning on her for support as they walked amid the pines. He paused by a small grove overlooking a valley where wildflowers danced in the breeze. Taking Ruby's hands in his, he met her eyes. "I never planned on taking a wife," he admitted, voice thick with emotion. "Never thought I was fit for it. But living with you these past months, seeing your strength and kindness, I don't want a life without you, Ruby." Tears blurred her vision, and she squeezed his hands. "Are you asking?" he exhaled shakily. "If you'd be my wife. I ain't got a ring or fancy words. I can't promise you comfort or an easy existence. All I can promise is that I'll do my damnedest to protect you, cherish you, and never let anyone mock or belittle you again." She let out a choked laugh, tears of joy rolling down her cheeks. "That's the most beautiful proposal I've ever heard. And so with no congregation, no priest on hand, and only the wind as witness." They spoke quiet vows to each other. Vows that had been forged through adversity, respect, and a love that had grown in the silence of winter nights. Later, Dr. Weston, on one of his visits, would marry them officially, beneath that same pine canopy using a well-worn Bible. But in their hearts, they were already bound that day by the wildflowers. Sometime later, Sawyer and Ruby decided to formalize their union in the eyes of the territorial courts. After all, certain legalities required a recognized marriage. Thus, they made another journey down to Cheyenne. This time, Ruby rode with pride, her posture straight, wearing a simple yet flattering dress she had sewn herself. As they entered town, she noticed how onlookers stared, but she refused to shrink beneath their gaze. The local judge was a stoic man who rarely let emotion slip, but even he smiled at the sight of the unconventional couple. After signing the paperwork, Sawyer gave Ruby a gentle kiss on her brow, and they left the small courthouse hand in hand. A few curious passers-by recognized Ruby from the fiasco months before. Some were openly astonished at her transformation from the derided mail-order bride to a woman brimming with quiet confidence. Word spread quickly about Sawyer McAllister's marriage. Even the men at the feed store, who once snickered at Ruby's expense, eyed her with a hint of respect, for they knew Sawyer's reputation as a man to be reckoned with. One man, the same ranch hand who had made a snide remark before, approached them timidly. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said when you first arrived. I was wrong." He offered a clumsy bow. Ruby could have easily rebuked him. Instead, she nodded graciously. "We all say things we regret. I appreciate your apology." And that was another sign of her growth. She realized that she no longer craved their approval. She had found acceptance within herself and in Sawyer's unwavering devotion. Just as they were preparing to leave Cheyenne, fate dealt one more surprising card. Ruby and Sawyer were approaching the stage station to check if any mail had arrived for them when they spied a familiar face stepping off a coach. Harold Beckett. He stood there wide-eyed, clutching a leather valise, scanning the crowd as though searching for someone. Then his gaze landed on Ruby. Shock rippled across his features. Ruby's heart hammered, but she remained composed. With Sawyer by her side, she approached Harold, who stared at her in disbelief. "Ruby, I hardly recognized you." Indeed, the months of rugged living had honed her physique, and her confidence shone in her eyes. She wasn't the timid, unsure woman he had once taken for granted. "Harold," she said, politely stepping forward. "I got your letters." "I know," he replied, voice halting. "I came here hoping you'd changed your mind." He eyed Sawyer warily, noting the protective way he stood close to Ruby. "But it appears I'm too late." "I'm Sawyer McAllister," came the low, firm introduction. "Ruby's husband." Harold paled. You're married." Ruby nodded, gentle, yet resolute. "I am." "You came too late, Harold. I'm not the same woman who arrived here all those months ago. I found a life where I'm valued." He swallowed his gaze, flicking over her regret etched on his face. "I see," he managed. "I know I can never truly make up for what I did to you. But you must believe me. I do regret it." Ruby paused, remembering the hurt and humiliation. But she also recalled how that pain led her to the mountains to Sawyer, and ultimately to finding her true self. "I believe you," she said quietly, "and I forgive you." Harold's shoulders slumped, relief and sorrow mingling in his eyes. He offered a sad smile. "Thank you, Ruby. I wish you happiness." With that, they parted ways, Harold heading off in search of new prospects, and Ruby returning to the mountains with the man who had shown her acceptance and love when she needed it most. Life in the mountains was never easy. Each year brought new challenges. Harsh winters, unpredictable hunts, and the constant struggle to maintain their homestead. But Ruby faced every hurdle alongside Sawyer. They expanded the cabin, adding a proper kitchen and a small spare room for guests or perhaps children one day. Their bond deepened with every trial they overcame, forging a love not reliant on grand gestures or social approval, but rather on mutual respect, shared labor, and the simple joy of each other's company. Ruby, once ridiculed for her body, discovered that her strength was a blessing. Her arms, capable of hauling water and splitting logs, were the same arms that embraced Sawyer each night, offering solace and warmth. And Sawyer, the solitary mountain man, realized that loving someone did not diminish his independence. Rather, it enriched his life beyond measure. In the end, their story spread quietly through the territory as an example of unexpected love blossoming in the unlikeliest of places. Some folks shook their heads, unable to comprehend how a mail-order bride jilted at the stagecoach found happiness in the arms of a rough-hewn trapper. Others saw it as proof that the frontier was a place where misfits and dreamers could carve out a destiny all their own. And so the woman once mocked for her body became the heart of a mountain home, a home built on acceptance, tenacity, and a devotion that the clamor of society had never managed to extinguish. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey into the wild heart of the American frontier. Ruby's resilience and Sawyer's steadfast devotion remind us that genuine love, no matter how unexpected, can forge an unbreakable bond. In a world that often judges based on appearance and superficial standards, their story celebrates true beauty, born of character, kindness, and unwavering loyalty. If you found inspiration in Ruby's courage and Sawyer's quiet strength, please consider showing your support. Like this video to let us know you enjoyed the tale, share it with friends who appreciate a heartwarming Wild West romance, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more immersive stories filled with drama triumph and a dash of destiny. Saddle up for the next adventure. And may you too find the steadfast love that recognizes your worth, just as Ruby did in the mountains.